I'm Liam Kelly from the Institute of Asian Studies, and I'm talking today with Lisa Arensen, also of the Institute of Asian Studies, and we're going to be talking about the environment in Cambodia. Okay, thank you, Lisa. So Lisa is new to the Institute. You started in January. And so for our many viewers who are out there, perhaps you could just say a little bit about your background and how you got interested in studying about Cambodia.
Yeah, thank you, Liam, for inviting me to this series. When I first moved to Cambodia, I didn't know anything about it. I was interested in working in anti-human trafficking, and there was a program in Cambodia that invited me to come. So, but I was very interested when I got there in understanding how a country recovers from a very long war. Because of my childhood, I originally lived in South Sudan, and my family left when the war came back. And I was interested in how Cambodians were showing incredible resilience, and at the same time trying to deal with a great deal of social and economic and environmental damage after almost 40 years of war in some parts of the country. So I ended up spending about 6 years in applied research in Cambodia, and then I eventually decided to go back and do my postgraduate work, and I was in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where I did my master's degree and my PhD.
Okay, and so the work in anti-trafficking would have been the early 2000s, or?
Yes.
Okay, I see. So I'm just trying to, put it in the context of Cambodian history. So that's after almost a decade of the UN, the transition to democracy and things like this, right?
Yes, yeah. The last major, in 1998 was the last coup in Cambodia. Right. And so when I came in 1999, things were settling down.
Okay. So then you, that's a kind of a common, not a common, but that is one approach of people who go to a country, they start to, get fascinated with it, and then decide, actually, I really want to know more about this, and then go to get a PhD. And so you did that, but then your PhD research was on Cambodia as well.
It was.
And this gets into one of the main themes of your research, I think, which was examining life in a post-conflict environment. Is that correct?
That is correct. I became very interested in how people resettle war-altered landscapes, and that is what my PhD ended up focusing on. And in Cambodia, like several of the other countries in mainland Southeast Asia, part of resettling the war-altered landscape is actually dealing with the remnants of war and military waste in the landscape. So the place where I did my PhD research was a landscape that had been spontaneously resettled by communities that knew the land they were coming to was potentially contaminated with landmines and unexploded ordnance, but they came anyway. And so I was interested in what drove people to make those choices, how they navigated the remnants of war, and how they both survived and did not survive in some cases. I was a little bit naive in assuming that the explosive remnants of war would be the top priority on people's minds when resettling a dangerous landscape. It turned out that there were many, many other concerns people had to navigate and deal with, including social alliances, people living together after the war who had fought on opposite sides, including changes in people's religious beliefs. The traditional religion of Cambodia is based around land-based spirits. And so, of course, if the land itself has been harmed, how does that affect people's beliefs and people's engagements with the spirit world? I also wasn't entirely prepared for how much the actual people who had died from the war, the missing dead, the dead in the landscape, people actually had to interact in these landscapes with the bodies and ghosts of the dead, and how that affected resettlement as well. So it turned out to be a very multifaceted set of things people had to sort of struggle to reconcile or creatively reconstruct in terms of sort of social and cultural practices, as well as the very material realities of trying to live excuse me, in a dangerous landscape after the war.
That is super interesting. Let me ask first, where was that your main research was taking place?
Excuse me, sorry. In far western Cambodia.
Okay.
In far western Battambang province, which is east of the Great Lake, the Tonle Sap, but west of the Tonle Sap, but east of Pai Lin, which was one of the last major Khmer Rouge strongholds up against the Thai border.
And that was one of the most heavily mined areas, right? Is that, or?
It was one of the areas that had the highest rate of casualties from
I see. Wow.
mines. And
so you just touched on actually an issue that I've always wondered about. The one of how do people who are on both sides deal with that when they're living in the same village when peace comes?
Yeah.
And is there something you discovered with that, or?
There's been a lot of anthropological research on that in different post-conflict areas, and the answers vary widely from country to country and society to society. In my study area in the far western Cambodia, people actually managed it, and I have actually written a paper about this, about how narratives and memory, how people re-narrated. Basically, a lot of people reconstructed their social relations by reconstructing them as newcomers to the area.
Oh, yeah.
So even people who actually had long histories in the place said to me that they were newcomers now.
Huh.
And actually people recreated a communal identity based on the return to the landscape, based on the fact they came back. They're all equally poor, equally destitute, equally landless, and they had to struggle to eke a living out of the forest and turn it back to farmland, remove the landmines. And that act of struggling together in the forest formed the basis for a new identity.
Wow. Okay.
So it's not that people denied what had happened in the past, which was often very painful. Like in many civil wars, families actually broke apart, some siding with the Khmer Rouge, some siding with the Cambodian state back in the late 1960s. And even in the second civil war in the 1980s and 1990s, families often fell on different sides. But instead of focusing on these sort of fissures of the past, people really focused on the coming together to remake themselves in the landscape.
I see.
And that formed sort of a new identity that kind of superseded some of the painful memories of the past.
That's really interesting. Then the other thing you just mentioned was the spirits. So I'm guessing here, let's imagine that there was a spirit in a great banyan tree and the tree got blown up. And then is that the type of thing that's happening when the landscape gets changed, or?
Yeah, there was also a great deal of deforestation in the years after the war, and some of the forced labor projects. So changes to the physical landscape from a Khmer traditional religious perspective can affect the spirit world because spirits tend to live within the physical landscape, and spirits are guardians of place. So a lot of people thought that the spirits had diminished in power because there was now widespread deforestation and changes in weather and climate. And some people thought that the Khmer Rouge taking over and sort of attacking Buddhism and all forms of religion, people couldn't practice traditional rituals during the Khmer Rouge period. And that, again, is thought to weaken the spirits because people feed the spirits and the spirits bless the people in return. There's a sort of almost an ethics of care between people in the spirit world. But a lot of people didn't think the spirit world was gone. They just thought it was diminished.
I see.
And there were other elders who would insist that actually it was just as strong as before. It was just harder to access, almost like the doors between this world and the next were more firmly closed now, because they saw that as a direct result of society becoming more selfish in the need to survive after the war. A lot of elders saw themselves as less communal, less sort of humane towards each other, more focused on survival. And that sort of behavior was seen as against some of the different kinds of spirits who believe in sort of compassion and sharing. This is really complex stuff. But basically, and I did write a paper about this, so some people saw spirits as being displaced, some saw them as diminished, but some insisted that they would stay forever no matter how bad material conditions got, because this was their place. And it was ubiquitous that people continued to, when entering forested areas in particular, outside of the protection of Buddhist domains, people would continue to make offerings, sometimes informal shrines, and kind of tell the spirit world they were coming in. There's also a huge emphasis on moral behavior as a form of protection. If you came to a place and cleared a landscape because of need, that was considered as acceptable to the spirit world versus if you were greedy and you came in with a bulldozer and you just took out the trees for your own private wealth seeking, that was considered immoral behavior. So there's a morality of behavior even when it comes to actually changing the forest.
I see. Wow. Okay. We're still filming, yeah? They're both on red?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm fascinated by the conversation.
Yeah, this is really super interesting. But we got to move on. And so as fascinating as that research is, and we're going to link all of this below in the video, you've now moved on to another topic, which is researching about people who live in protected areas, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so could you explain a little about what that is?
Yeah, that shift happened sort of in conjunction with my last position was with a field-based environmental studies program. And so I moved to a different part of Cambodia and was able to do a lot of research with undergraduate students in 2 national parks. One in Phnom Kulen, which is just north of Angkor Wat in Siem Reap, and one in the eastern highlands of Cambodia, which is a majority Bunong indigenous area up near the Vietnamese border on the edge of the Annamite Mountains.
Which province is that in?
Mondulkiri.
Okay, right. Okay.
So yeah, one of the least populated provinces in Cambodia, and then one of the heavily populated on the west. So
yeah. So what is this protected areas? What does that mean to life in protected areas?
Yeah, unlike a lot of places around the world, Cambodia has left people living within conservation zones. So villages had a long-standing claim to a place that became a protected area. Often these protected areas were re-gazetted in the 90s as the war drew to a close, including both of the places where I did a lot of my work. And villages were allowed to remain within the park, but suddenly, of course, they fall under conservation regulations. So certain kinds of subsistence behaviors, certain kinds of hunting and poaching and non-timber forest product gathering are now forbidden. Others are supposed to be monitored. And obviously logging is supposed to be very carefully controlled. At the same time, there's a heavy encroachment from outsiders into conservation areas in Cambodia, both for in-migration and then agricultural expansion, illegal logging. So there's immense pressure on these areas from outside, as well as increasing populations within the villages with the inside. So from a conservation perspective, people living in protected areas is a very difficult thing to monitor. And there's very strong push from conservation NGOs to encourage communities to become less reliant on natural resources and find alternative sources of income. So they promote things, for example, like ecotourism or cultural heritage tourism as best they can. My interest hasn't been specifically on tourism in the park so much as looking at communities and, again, how communities are dealing with these immense environmental changes to their landscape and traditional practices. A lot of these communities are also have entered into the cash crop commodity market, like many Cambodian farmers. So, for example, in Phnom Kulen National Park, perhaps even just 20 years ago, most of the 9 villages on the plateau practiced rotating swidden agriculture for highland rice. And now there's almost no rice cultivation on the mountain. Almost everyone has switched to cashew trees, which of course grow in fixed orchards.
Right. Okay.
So there's been enormous changes in agricultural life worlds over the last 20 years.
Is that because of the regulations from the park, the saying you can't?
It was not.
Okay,
it was mostly a desire to make
more money. Yeah, okay, wow.
At the end of the war. But of course, the result of fixed cropping is that people then make more and more farms because the cashew just sits. You don't change it, you don't plant food crops around it. And so then people want to clear new forests to have food crops. And so it's led to increasing degradation of the national park. And until quite recently, communities didn't really face many penalties for that. And now the Ministry of Environment is starting to try to enforce its regulations more strictly, which is leading to big changes for communities on the mountain. There's also been a lot of changes for communities in terms of traditional Khmer medicine. What medicines people use and gather. There's been a big push by the Cambodian state to medicalize birth. A lot of Cambodia's traditional medicines are geared towards the postpartum care period for the 6 months to a year after a woman delivers a baby, she traditionally takes a variety of traditional medicines. The Cambodian government has encouraged women to deliver in clinics and to stop using traditional medicines, at least in the places where my fieldwork has occurred, but I suspect nationally as well.
Right.
So these are big changes for people in terms of they're cultural shifts, but they're also shifts to how people have been using natural resources for a very long time in Cambodia. And at the same time, there's rapid modernization and development. So people living in these protected areas aren't sort of living in a bubble where life goes on as it has for hundreds of years. Even though they live in protected areas, there's the same market forces on them. There's the same challenges that Cambodians face in lowland areas. But people living in parks tend to live in more remote places with less access to markets. And so I'm very interested in how traditional ecological knowledge changes in those situations, how people's relationship with the environment. And again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I'm very interested in how people's traditional religious practices are influenced by or sort of almost counter some of these forces of development and modernity.
Yeah. What in terms of religion have you found in these protected areas?
So there are two very different people groups. The Bunong people against the Cambodian Vietnamese border are, they view themselves as people who live in the forest. And so their relationship with the forest in a cosmological or religious sense is quite different than the Khmer ethnic majority I do work with in Siem Reap. But so to take one at a time, I guess, Bunong people in the highlands are quite concerned. The youth are often is a strong word. Some of the youth, reportedly, are involved in illegal logging. They're hired by the brokers to be the ones who actually do the most high risk work of cutting a forest in cutting a tree in a protected area, cutting it and removing it to these way stations. And because of where Mondulkiri is located, a great deal of the illegal timber actually goes straight across the border. And that part of Cambodia is Khao Sema Wildlife Sanctuary is very, very close to the Vietnamese border. So a fair bit of hardwood that is logged out of that part goes across the border into the hardwood trade in Vietnam. And Bunong youth, almost exclusively male youth, the kind of cash they're offered to participate in this risky, illegal business is astronomically higher than what they can make by doing any legal work. So it's quite hard to resist from an economic standpoint. I've had some students, we started doing, it's a very sensitive topic, but we've done a little bit of research on youth's views of illegal logging. And it was actually quite surprising to me because a lot of the youth expressed quite a bit of grief and sorrow over the loss of the forest and the rise of illegal logging in their home territories, which doesn't mean they didn't participate in it, but they weren't happy about it. It's complex. And one of the things that they felt was that perhaps things like increasing dryness and drought and changes in weather and climate they're being punished by the spirits because they'd failed to protect the forest.
Interesting.
So there was a lot of environmental links to concerns about the spirit world by Bunong youth. At the same time, they felt if they didn't participate in illegal logging, other ethnic groups around them would anyway. So it's kind of, you either get in on it and you get a bit of cash, or you resist and you end up poor. So they feel very conflicted, the youth. There's also a strong pressure to assimilate and join sort of modern Cambodian nation state and care about status symbols like expensive motorbikes and cell phones. So there's a lot of pressure for Bunong youth to become involved in illegal logging. As a counterpart to that, many Bunong elders are involved in community networks, indigenous activist networks trying to protect forests. So you have a very interesting intergenerational division amongst the Bunong indigenous group, where the older generation still really values the forest and wants to protect the forest, and the younger generation often feels quite conflicted about what to do. Situation's quite different in Gulen National Park. In that case, people are still continuing their traditional religious practices to do with land-based spirits, And most of the illegal logging is not driven by the local community, but rather outside forces.
Okay, I see. So this level of information that you're sharing here just shows me that this is the product of some serious and long-term research. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit. I mean, obviously you're speaking Khmer with these people, and the Bunong, they speak Khmer enough, or do you?
Almost all Bunong men speak Khmer fluently.
Okay.
The women, it kind of depends on what part of Bunong territory or homeland they live in.
And so could you explain a little bit, I mean, you've been in Cambodia for about 6 years prior to coming here, right? And then, of course, there must have been, I mean, you were there, or I can't remember, you've been there
I've been
over
there
a long...
about 13 years in total,
Okay.
yes.
And so I'm just curious to know, like, how you do your research.
Yeah, I prefer to do extended research in certain villages over a long period of time rather than try to go to a lot of villages, partly because, as you say, relationships are very valuable. I usually try to work with a Khmer research assistant in the field rather than do interviews myself for cultural reasons. It's common in Cambodia to talk in groups and with a mediator if there's a stranger involved, but also because obviously I'm not fluent in Khmer. There are words I don't understand. And because I might miss cultural nuances that my Cambodian colleagues will notice. So whenever possible, I do work with a research assistant. If I work in Highland Cambodia, if I can, I work with Bunong friends, and they will translate. I much prefer to do mother tongue language interviews. If necessary, yes, we can do it in Khmer, but if possible, I much prefer to do it in Bunong. So if I am working with a Bunong friend, I would ask the questions in Khmer and they would translate them into Bunong and then back to Khmer. So it gets a little bit complex, but I don't speak
But then
enough.
afterwards you would...
Then I would transcribe it to English.
But then if there's some point you're really curious about, you can follow up with the person and say, what exactly did they say in Bunong and how does it...
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great, okay.
But I don't unfortunately speak Bunong.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's limits to what we can do. Yeah, that's it's impressive already.
But when possible, I've had times in the field where I needed to translate directly for North American students from English to Khmer and back again. And yes, I can do that, but I really value working with a Cambodian research assistant for so many reasons.
Right. Especially there, I mean, you're getting into variations of region and things like that and accents and things. Yeah, for sure. Okay. This has been absolutely fascinating. I love all of these topics, and these are all topics I'm going to want to read up about, and I will do that by reading your research, which we're going to link below here. But I really look forward to see the new stuff that's coming out as well. So I think that's great, and I want to thank you very much for sitting down and talking to us. And welcome to the Institute of Asian Studies.
Thank you, Leo. I'm very happy to be here.
All right.